Coming to recognize you are wrong is like coming to recognize you are sick. You feel bad long before you admit you have any of the symptoms, and certainly long before you are willing to take your medicine. I felt another trip to Mann Gulch coming on. Harry Gisborne had taken only one trip into Mann Gulch and hadn't made it back. I had 3 trips to my credit, one each for the last 3 summers. If I had to make a fourth, I would be exactly 20 years older than Gisborne had been when Jansen left him lying on his back with the moon moving across the lenses of his glasses. Although I was reluctant about coming to Missoula this particular Friday, I actually came to town earlier than usual so Laird and I could report to Edward Heilman on the condition of the crosses in Mann Gulch. When we had been in Mann Gulch on July 1, all of them, we reported, had been inspected by at least one of our party and were in acceptable condition for the time being. I expressed the hope that the crosses would be inspected in another 5 years, since concrete crumbles fast on a hill exposed to record extremes of weather. He assured me that such an inspection would be made, and Laird spoke up and promised he would make the first 5-year inspection plus a follow-up as often as needed. On this morning, when some of the key stones seemed to be giving way in the small memorial of knowledge I was hoping to erect to the dead in Mann Gulch, it was something somewhat comforting to be assured that at least the crosses would not be allowed to crumble away. When we sat down to lunch, I said, "It's not right." Laird said, I know it. Neither of us had to ask what it was. I went on without pausing. The base of that tall standing tree is too close to the reef. It's probably no more than 60 or 70 yards from the crevice, and that makes where Dodge started his fire too close to the top. All testimony said it was about 200 yards. That's what the Board of Review said, and they were only quoting what the survivors said. Besides, Laird observed, having been a foreman of smoke jumpers himself, it doesn't make sense. It's hard to believe as tough as foreman of Dodge would call it quits as close as 60 yards from safety. Laird may have asked the question, but I think I asked it because I had gone into Mann Gulch hoping to find out not only more about fire and about death by fire, but also more about the life afterwards of those who almost die by fire. So I think I was the only one who asked, do you think they could have succeeded in trying not to remember? I knew, of course, that Jansen had spent much of the rest of his life remembering. I had even heard that he had told the Board of Review he would answer questions about his retrieval of bodies only if he could testify with his back to them so that they could not see his face. The 2 survivors could be a very different case. They were young, one even underage, and they had almost died with almost all their life yet to live. Maybe when you almost die, almost before you live, there is a mechanism in you that makes you reduce your memories of death so most of life will not be based on death. I was making a world made up of guesses. It was Laird who said, it's sure strange that they remembered exactly where Hellman's Cross should be from at least half a mile away. He added, I can tell you something else that seems strange about that dead standing tree in the hillside. I replied, you tell me yours and I'll tell you another, and let's both go back to work. He said if Dodge lit his fire at the base of that tree, then 4 or 5 of the crew, certainly Reba and Silva, died long before they caught up to Dodge. Their crosses are not nearly as far up Gulch as where Rumsey and Solis say Dodge stopped and lit his fire, but Dodge thought they'd all passed him. Laird looked at his watch and asked, what were you going to tell me before I went back to the office? I told him, I was going to tell you I don't think Dodge would light his fire in a depression, and the base of the highest standing tree is in a depression between 2 lateral ridges. I had reason to back up this conviction that I thought would appeal to Laird as a foreman who had led smoke jumpers to fires. Dodge would not light his fire in a depression where his men could not see him. His men were behind him and were evidently just coming out of the edge of the timber when he lit his match. Solis is undoubtedly right in insisting that the origin of Dodge's fire has to be located from where the crevice above he could see Dodge lie down in it because he saw him. But the seeing argument works both ways. Dodge's fire also has to be located where, from behind him, Dodge's crew could see him light it. Laird was getting back to work. The days were turning hot and dry. Then came the lightning storms and the fires that show up by next morning. So it was a long time before he and I got together again, although I know he was happy in the meantime. He had been ejected from his desk chair in the regional office in Missoula to be foreman of an emergency crew on a big fire on Scapegoat Mountain. At our next lunch together, I told Laird, I've been thinking over what you said about Reba and Silva's crosses having to be up gulch from Dodge's fire, and now I know how we should go about checking on the location of the escape fire when we go back to Mann Gulch next summer. Fine, Laird replied, and I've got a better plan for going into the gulch than any we've used before. I think it will be easier, meaning without saying so that he thought it would be easier for me. Actually, we were starting again a long way from where we had left off. In the interval, each had gone on with his thinking about our problems and was assuming that the other shared his new conclusions. We both were starting again on the assumption that we were going back to Mann Gulch next summer, although we had not parted with any such agreement, and the fact is that both of us had hoped our trip into Mann Gulch in 1978 with the survivors would be our last one. For us, a trip to Mann Gulch meant about 150 miles over the Continental Divide, dragging a boat with a motor that might not work. After that came the 76% slope having no shade, but lots of rocks cracking apart with heat and rattling with snakes. Yet we began by discussing Laird's new way of going back into Mann Gulch. I'm thinking, he said, that this time we should come in the back way over the head of the gulch from Willow Creek, where there used to be a kind of a road. If I can get my truck nearly to the top of the divide between Willow Creek and Mann Gulch, then a lot of the climbing will have been done for us, and we can side hill from the head of the gulch down to the crosses. Sounds fine, I said, and we talked as if we were already on our way back, and with some dehydrating alternations, this is the way we went when the time came. When Laird had been constructing a more efficient way to reach Mann Gulch, I had been working on a fresh method to locate the origin of Dodge's fire when we got there. Until it was located, I would have no common point from which to measure times and distances converging and diverging. The origin of the escape fire was the one place on the ground that they all touched at the end. It is possible to trace some of the steps in thought that led us to Dodge's fire. Of all objections Laird and I had to locating the origin of Dodge's fire at the base of the highest standing tree, the most convincing to me was that it would mean the men whose crosses are lowest on the hill were a long way behind Dodge when they died. I didn't believe this and was soon asking myself how I could find solid evidence against it. I thought again about the location of the crosses, because the location of the crosses is as close to certainty as anything on that ambiguous mountain. The crosses were placed where the bodies were found, and Jansen himself left a pile of rocks with a note underneath identifying each body and recording how the identification was made. Probably only the location of Hellman's concrete cross is far wrong, but then Hellman died in the hospital and there was no pile of rocks with a note underneath to mark where his cross should be placed. This line of thought soon leads to the question, which of all these crosses is most reliably located? And the answer to this one depends entirely upon remembering the testimony about the fire, so that the answer can be visualized from the photograph of Reba's cross. The answer is Silva's cross, which stands next to a big flat rock about 200 yards straight uphill from Reba's cross and slightly outside the left border of the photograph. Certainty requires such a rock beside Silva's cross. So Lee remained somewhat in doubt about his own location of the origin of Dodge's fire, because there is no big flat rock close enough to be the rock where Silva was found, and Salih is the one who should best remember the rock. Exhausted as he must have been, he kept going all the night of the fire until he had led the rescue team first back to Hellman, and then crossed the divide to Silva, tottering on that flat rock, pleading, "Don't look at my face, it's awful." The process of thinking for some may run smoothly, but mine, insofar as it is observable to me, is more like one of those little mud geysers in Yellowstone Park, alternating between bubbles of mud and a puff of smoke and mud again. I puffed smoke as I concentrated on Silva's cross, and when the smoke had cleared away, Silva's cross had connected in thought with what I had long been trying to find, Dodge's fire. In bubbles had come the memory of Dodge's testimony about his actions after the main fire had passed him by. He had stood up in the ashes of his own fire, had heard a voice that seemingly was a long way off, but turned out to be only a short distance up gulch and below him, and following it had found Silva, whose body was so badly burned Dodge had placed him on a big flat rock out of the ashes. Dodge's memory was very precise, including the estimate of the distance between where he had been lying in his own fire and where he had found Silva. Upon investigation, I found Silva approximately 100 feet below and 100 to 200 feet to the east of my location. So, after Laird had finished his colorful description of our coming entrance into Mann Gulch, riding in a chariot with a four-wheel drive, I said, "And when we get there, let's head straight for Silva's Cross and be sure we have a 100-yard tape measure with us, since we'll be starting from Silva's Cross to find where Dodge stood up in his fire." I told Laird we'll be doing Dodge's estimated distance backwards. First 100 feet upslope from Silva's Cross, then 100 to 200 feet to the left toward the mouth of the gulch. Robinson said a marker might be there. I said it could be, but it may be, may be no longer. We both knew, of course, that concrete crosses had been placed to mark the dead, but we also knew that initially, a few days after the fire, temporary wooden crosses had been erected, and that the origin of the escape fire had also been marked. Its location almost certainly would have been accurate. Dodge returned to the scene of the fire the afternoon after it had passed and remained there until all the bodies were found. Part of this time he spent in showing Jansen the place where he had lit his fire, which was then marked with a pile of rocks and a wooden cross. Laird and I assumed that this wooden cross had long ago disappeared, and certainly it was nowhere to be seen when we walked along the slope with Rumsey and Salih. But if the cross is still there, Laird said, it would be sure proof. It was a long lunch and a long time before we got back to Mann Gulch, and on the way toward finding the truth, there was a lot of mud in the geyser between the bubbles and the smoke. It was even later than planned before we returned to Mann Gulch. We had planned to be there by the 1st of July, before the temperature started to set records, but these plans were made before the ex-foreman of the smoke jumpers remembered this was the time of the year when salmon run the rivers of British Columbia. Accordingly, he weakened his shock absorbers over 2,000 miles of Canadian dirt roads, only to discover that 50-pound salmon have no trouble breaking 60-pound test line. I found myself pleased to tell him on his return, "Hell, you're too old to believe fishing tackle manufacturers." On the Blackfoot, where I don't expect to catch trout over 2 or 3 pounds, I always use 8-pound test leaders. I added, even then I stop a couple of times a day to tie a fresh leader. So when we finally started for Mann Gulch on July 24th, 1979, it was 94 degrees in Helen, not quite so hot as the record 97 on the day of the fire, but hot enough to prompt us to divide jobs toward the end of the afternoon to get the day's work done. I was to side hill to the crosses, and the end of the day by hitting the top of the ridge and following it back to the head of the gulch, there to meet Laird, whose late afternoon mission would take him up the bottom of the gulch. On my way back, I quit worrying about dying from a heart attack. Even before I reached the top of the ridge, death from dehydration seemed more immediate. But even so, I knew that, thanks to the variable winds that abide on the tops of ridges, I couldn't be in such imminent danger as Laird. In the bottom of the gulch, not a thing stirred but Laird. So when we met at the head of the gulch, both of us just short of death, I asked him out of curiosity, "How hot do you think it is in the bottom?" "Between 120 and 130 degrees, he answered. "Now be serious," I said, "and remember 140 degrees is getting toward lethal." He said, "Between 120 and 130 degrees, and he's been in a lot of heat in his day. But you remember," he added, "the temperature is taken in the shade, and there is no shade in the bottom of Mann Gulch." In many ways, the trip turned out to be all we could have hoped for, partly because the heat gave us some sense of what men suffered in Mann Gulch on August 5, 1949. We could never have realized our plan to come into the head of Mann Gulch by way of Willow Creek without the kindness of the Montana Fish and Game Commission. They not only gave us permission to enter by way of Willow Creek, which is on the old Jim McGregor ranch the commission bought for a game preserve, but furnished us with saddle horses and trucked the horses to the end of the road where our four-wheel drive could go no further. Maybe I could have made it into the gulch without a horse, but my body would have to wait for a helicopter to bring it back. Even on the way in, I was given a disturbing glimpse of what I was going to suffer for having done so much easy climbing with my old Dunham climbing boots. Without noticing it, I'd worn the lugs on their soles too smooth to climb a 76% slope slick with dry grass. On the way in, while spelling my horse by leading her through a rocky stretch, I slipped and fell under her legs. I could see it happening in all its parts, part by part. I could see I was falling uphill under her legs, and I seemed to have time to try to reverse the direction and fall away from her, and then, fast as it was happening, I had time to see I was powerless to make any decision and time still to see. I couldn't see what her back legs were doing, but fortunately time to see that her front legs were curling as if her bones were soft and were curling to bring her hoofs down on the hill just above my head. After all this, there was time to start loving my horse. This was just a premonition of what was coming in the afternoon, when I had to climb the 76% slope, pulling myself from one fistful of grass to the next. Even so, I did not suffer as much from my hands as from thirst. When we reached the head of Mann Gulch, we stood looking for a tree to tie our horses to. Nearly all of the trees burned 30 years before, having rotted at the roots and fallen, so we had to settle for a couple of rotten fallen trees, which might possibly hold, and we tied our horses to them. But all day I watched my horse at great distance, expecting to see her pull out for home. She was such a good horse that I'm sure she could have pulled loose, but she didn't, and it must have been terrible to have been tied there in that heat. Paul Lloyd Davis had come with us on this trip to help run our 100-yard tape measure. He's an ex-firefighter and an old friend of Laird's, and at the time was a reporter for a Missoulian television station, and we were glad to have another ex-firefighter along to share our sufferings. Lloyd Davis and I started side-hilling toward the crosses from the head of the gulch, with what had developed into a two-pronged plan to close in on the origin of the escape fire and to leave no doubt behind. One prong was to start at the most reliable mark on the hillside, Silva's Cross, and from it measure backward to Dodge's fire using Dodge's estimate of the distance from where he lay down in his fire to where he found Silva afterwards beside his flat rock. The second prong had been added to our original plan of attack in the winter. I had been rearranging my files as I do now and then to remind myself what is in them. In a file marked Yonts, Susan, Washington, D.C., I found a photograph of the site of the Mann Gulch tragedy taken on August 16, 1949, with the origin of Dodge's fire marked on it. At the time Susan Yonts found this photo for me, she was working in the Forest Service's Office of Information in Washington, and I was just starting a serious study of the Mann Gulch fire. Before long, I happened to mention to her that I was the son of a Presbyterian minister, and she said she was the daughter of one herself, and pretty soon she knew as much about the Mann Gulch fire as I did, maybe more. And certainly she soon had produced more documents about the fire out of various archives than I could understand or knew what to do with. This photograph, which is reproduced on pages 12 and 13 of the photo gallery, I had enough instinct to take with me. Whoever made the notations on this photograph had trouble spelling received, and we were almost certain that the notation Rumsey Salih Hellman crossed here does not point to the right crevice. But we were guessing that the location of Dodge's fire on the photograph might be correct because in the file with it was another photograph which in the same handwriting as received records the same date, August 16, 1949, and the reason for the occasion, men in foreground are placing crosses. So August 16, 1949 is the day of the wooden crosses, one of which had been placed where Dodge lit his fire. Laird immediately became attached to the photograph. He is many fine things, including a fine photographer, but first of all, he's a woodsman, and you aren't a woodsman unless you have such a feeling for topography that you can look at the earth and see what it would look like without any woods or covering on it. It's something like the gift all men wish for when they're young or old, of being able to look through a woman's clothes and see her body, possibly even a little of her character. This may help to explain why there are few really good woodsmen and many who hope to be. Laird said, "Let me study that photograph." So we had the second prong of our attack, and while Lloyd Davis and I were to side hill from the head of the gulch towards Silva's Cross with the tape measure, Laird would cut directly for the bottom of the gulch, locate the spot where the August 16, 1949 photograph had been taken, and see if from there he could match the photograph's location of the escape fire with the topography. We hoped his route would take him to where Dodge's testimony would take me. We both knew that when, if Laird found the photograph and the topography matching, he was not going to see anything that on first glance would look much like the photograph. In the photograph, many of the trees killed by the fire are still standing. By now, most of the trees had rotted and fallen, and there had been almost no regrowth in the 30 years since. So Laird would be looking at a body with almost no covering, a long dead, unburied body. It should now be possible to accompany both Laird and me on our separate ways with our different evidence guiding us, we hoped, to the same place. To accompany Laird, you should first study this photograph as if you were a forensic pathologist, preparing to identify a victim in court by matching two views of the dead body. The first view, the photograph, is the body when it was still clothed, so you are forced to look through the clothing to match the second view, the view of the skeletal remains, the ground as it is today. As a forensic woodsman, you will have a fairly good idea after studying this photograph of what you should be looking for even before you enter the gulch. At least you might try to test yourself as a woodsman. It becomes a case of getting from the photograph the line that you will follow to the wooden cross, you hope. What you should first look for on the ground are those three white rocks in the lower right corner of the photograph marked cargo spot. They are on the edge of a finger gulch and form a line somewhat parallel to it. The three white rocks, unlike most of the standing trees in the photograph, should still be there and comparatively easy to see. They should be your location point. The three white rocks serve as a rear sight on your rifle. To find your target, you'll have to turn back to the photograph, run a line from the three white rocks through the cross that marks where Dodges set fire, and then continue the line up the ridge until it passes close to something in the photograph that is still there on the ground and is big and highly visible. Such a line, when extended, almost runs between two giant rocks on the reef. Then put the photograph back in your pack sack to keep it from getting soggy with perspiration, and start climbing toward the two rocks. You will know you are starting right if you cross two finger gulches, one straight and fairly deep, and next a curved off branch of the first. Shortly afterwards, if Sully remembered correctly, there should be a tall lone tree, fallen now, but if your line has been straight, you should spot it in the grass when you get close. Beyond, there should be many fallen trees, as there are many standing trees in the photograph, confirming Sully's testimony that just when he and Dieter and Ramsey came out of the patch of timber after dropping their tools, they looked ahead and saw Dodge bent over lighting his fire on a grassy slope. If you now join Laird and follow such a diagonal of topographical remains from three white rocks on the lower slope of the gulch to a pair of giant rocks on the reef, I hope that on the way you will stumble upon me waiting for you near a fallen dead tree on a grassy slope. With luck, there will also be a wooden cross somewhere close by in the grass. I was waiting. I could see Laird working slowly up the hill in my general direction. There were 3 or 4 obvious reasons why he was coming slowly, but only one why he never looked up at me. He felt it would be cheating to know in advance where the course he was following should lead him. Lloyd Davis and I were sitting where our tape measure had taken us from Silva's Cross. We had stuck together partly because it takes two to run a 100-yard steel tape measure on a hill where you need at least one hand to hang on to the grass. Also, if Lloyd Davis had gone with Laird, he would just be going through the bottom of a bottomless gulch. With me, he would be walking through the length of the crosses, from the four horsemen who ran farthest and the fastest to those who gave out the soonest. I walked through the lowest tier of crosses, heading as directly as possible to my memory of Silva's Cross. Lloyd Davis moved from cross to cross just above me. The crosses are almost indistinguishable from the bunch grass dried to hay, and the gray-white crumbled sandstone washed down from the reef through the millennia. Sometimes you come to the cross after next before you realize you have missed one, and nearly always you have to part a wreath of wild hay to find the name in the bronze. We shouted the names back and forth to each other, usually upper tier to lower tier and back again. David Navon called down and Mervyn Sherman called back. Leonard Piper called down and Robert Bennett called back. Then James Harrison called down, and I knew we were almost there. The names echoing up and down the hillside might have been a roll call in Arlington National Cemetery. Navon, 1st Lieutenant, 101st Airborne. Sherman, Seaman, 2nd Class, United States Navy. Piper, also United States Navy. Bennett, United States Army medical technician. As the hillside became ceremonial, old lines of poetry started through my head. In Flanders Field, the poppies blow between the crosses, row on row. I couldn't make myself go any further in the poem. Nothing but crosses fitted. Poppies, hell, everything was dead on the hillside, crumbling concrete crosses, rotting trees, dead grass. As for rows, there was a cross anywhere a body ran out of brains for lack of oxygen and rolled downhill into black death if it was lucky after being dead. Already, I was getting dehydrated and afraid I couldn't think straight. However, enough oxygen somehow got to my brain to enable me to observe that we hadn't seen a rattlesnake on the snake-infested field, and to conjecture that rattlesnakes, being cold-blooded and therefore sensitive to extremes of temperature, were in their holes to keep from frying. It was not possible, away from that hill, to feel its heat. It was hot enough so that I was becoming more and more afraid I could not think when I needed to. It frightened me that this was probably my last trip into Mann Gulch and my last chance to find out the truth of its tragedy. I kept myself going by reminding myself that the only poem I had a chance of writing about Mann Gulch was the truth about it. I kept saying to myself, remember, you've got to keep thinking straight even if you're too dry to swallow. I added, or to recite poems. I added a final truism for myself. True poems are hard to find. Lloyd Davis and I met at Silva's marker next to the big flat rock. Even after I had warned myself not to become overpowered by memory, I kept picturing Silva tottering on the rock and occasionally calling for help, then lapsing into unconsciousness so that it would take the rescue team a long time at night to locate his occasional conscious cries. He had only enough water left for a short drink apiece, so we decided to save it since we were sure to be in worse need later on. Instead, we started with the steel tape. I took the front end of it and went straight up slope. Lloyd Davis stayed at Silva's Cross to stop the tape when I had dragged it out 100 feet. Since we were measuring Dodge's estimates backwards, we first went 100 feet up slope from Silva's Cross, then 100 feet laterally toward the mouth of the gulch. I made a pile of rocks where Lloyd Davis called out 100 feet, waited until he climbed to where the pile was, then started laterally toward the mouth of the gulch as near as I could on the same contour for 150 feet, where I made another pile of rocks and sat down. Lloyd Davis remained at the first pile of rocks so Laird could see where both of Dodge's estimates had landed us. While Laird kept working uphill in a general direction toward us, but not looking at either of us, I wondered whether climbing straight up slope or side hilling constituted the more cruel and unusual punishment. Decided that there was no difference in the degree of punishment, only in the direction from which it came. When I was climbing up slope in my smooth, worn climbers, I fell downhill. When I fell side-hilling, I fell slightly uphill. Already weakened from falling uphill and downhill, I wondered if I could ever get back to my horse. I was afraid by now to look and see if she was still there. Otherwise, we just sat and waited on what must have been one of the hottest hillsides in what I remembered and had been described as one of the roughest pieces of country east of the Continental Divide. Laird kept coming in my general direction until he was 20 or 30 yards below me, still on his diagonal, probably still heading for the two giant rocks on the reef. Then he looked up and saw me. When he did, he changed his course and came straight up slope. I didn't like it that he evidently had to change his course to reach me. Finally, he sat down beside me and gulped but could not swallow or speak. When words could get out of his throat, he said, "No, we don't quite meet." When he had recovered sufficiently to give an explanation, he said, "To have met you on the course I was following, you should have been 15 or 20 yards farther toward the mouth of the gulch." I told him I could move 50 feet more that way and still keep within Dodge's estimates. Remember, Dodge said Silva was about 150 to 200 feet up gulch from his fire, but on purpose I came only 150 feet so I could go 50 more feet if I needed them and still be inside his estimate. He looked only partly relieved. He said, "Even if you were 50 feet further up gulch, I think you still would be at least that much too high upslope to have been on the line I was following." I wasn't quite so quick to meet that objection. In our operations, Laird had tended to designate me as the keeper and master of the documents, and I had tried not to disappoint him. At a minimum, I tried to know the most crucial ones by heart. Even in the heat, when everything seemed odd, I was able to finally to explain the oddity of why I was sitting 15 or 20 yards higher upslope than his angle would have projected him. "Yes," I said, "I think we are both dead on line. The location of Dodge's fire on your photograph is almost certainly the location of the wooden cross, and it almost certainly marks where Dodge lit his fire. But I have followed an estimate that Dodge made of the distance between him and Silva when Dodge stood up after the main fire had passed by him. Where Dodge lit his fire and where he lay down in it are two different places and are marked that way on the 1950 contour map as two different points with two different legends. Point 8 marks where Dodge set his escape fire, and point 9 further upslope has a legend Dodge survived here." Laird had reservations about the 1952 map, and I some myself, but I had come to believe in it on most important points, even if part of my belief rested on the a priori reasoning that it was issued at the time the Forest Service was faced with parental lawsuits charging negligence. Certainly Henry Thal, for one, would instantly have recognized any factual mistake the Forest Service made. I told Laird on the 1952 contour map, the spot where Dodge lit his fire is 3 contour lines downslope from where he was when he stood up after the main fire passed him by, and each contour on the map represents 20 feet of elevation. "God," Laird said, "do you think there's a marker there?" We both looked at where a marker ought to be if it were still standing and could see only grass. Even so, both of us would have bet on that some 50 feet laterally toward the mouth of the gulch and then some 60 feet downslope was where Dodge lit his gopher match. Neither of us, though, made a dash to find out, and only slowly and almost anonymously revealed to each other what was holding us back. Eventually, but clearly, we acknowledged to each other if we were right in our location of the origin of Dodge's fire, Sully could not have seen Dodge or the crew from the crevice he and Rumsey had located the summer before. Wow. We studied the reef above us. Directly above us was a wide open saddle. Then up gulch, a short distance from the saddle, the reef appeared and had no breaks in it. Then after a solid stretch of reef was a crevice. Without moving from where we sat, we studied the new crevice, which was on a slight angle to the right above us. Beyond it was still another wide saddle, the one which the summer before had brought us to the top of the ridge from Rescue Gulch. and after it was the crevice that Rumsey and Sallee had picked as the one through which they had reached safety. How far do you think it is to this new crevice, almost straight above us? About 200 yards, I answered. 100 to 200 yards would make it fit with the testimony in my pack sack. Laird nodded. Maybe a little less than 200, he said. Let's go. We again divided missions. Laird was to go down, and I was to go up. Neither of us had to be more specific than that. Lloyd Davis and the measuring tape went with me. Our chief job in going up was to measure the distance from Dodge's fire to the new crevice. Laird side-hilled 15 or 20 yards toward the mouth of the gulch before starting down. Down was where we hoped Dodge had lit his fire, about 20 yards down. I've had to learn a good many things to tell this story. One is how it might feel to die in the heat of the inferno. Since the inferno is also a pit, I have had to learn how to die in the inferno, always falling down, and always falling down I now know is a terrible way to die. It destroys the confidence before it destroys the body, and it must be terrible to die with nothing left but the body. As Lloyd Davis and I headed up the bridge toward the head of the gulch, I looked for Laird and saw him far off, stretched out in the shade of one of the standing snags on the lateral ridge toward the head of the gulch. Even so, he got to the horses before we did, and thinking of me, he led my horse at least 100 yards downslope, and I held my horse by her bridle to steady myself. For a guy who should have been close to death, Laird looked pretty animated. If you had one wish in the world, he asked, what would you wish most? I said without hope, a drink of cold water. He was deeply disappointed. Come on now, he said. If you had just one wish in the world, what would you wish? Cold water still had to be the only answer, but it wasn't the right one. I just stood there leaning against my horse and looking at him. He looked back at me pleadingly. Finally, he couldn't wait any longer for me to get enough oxygen in brains to wish right. The wooden cross, he said, trying to contain himself. The wooden cross. It had followed and was hidden in the grass, but it was right where it was supposed to be. I was glad it was still his turn to speak because I was still unsteady. He said, sure enough, it was a wooden cross, and he had found it almost exactly where the photograph and Dodge's testimony would have met, at the base of the largest tree on the hillside and the only one for some distance around. So it was almost exactly where all three projections meet, the photograph, Dodge's testimony, and Sallee's memory, almost at the base of that single tree, except it's fallen now, and the grass is tall. He added quickly, it was lying in the grass almost hidden, but I cleaned it off and set it up, piled rocks about it. You will see when I get my film developed. I turned my horse around so she stood below me. I needed the foot advantage that gave me to crawl into the saddle. My horse immediately started for the top of the ridge and probably for home, so I had to check her to give my speech. It's about 175 yards from the site of Dodge's fire to the crevice, I told him. He looked pleased and said, that's about right. I told him Sallee in his testimony said it was about 200 yards, and that's about what it looked like to me. He said it's so steep and rocky there it looks further than it is, especially when you know you're going to have to climb it. 175 yards is probably right. I held my horse back a moment longer. Guess, I asked him, what's on the other side of this crevice when you crawl through? Don't tell me, he said, his eyes wide. You're right, I told him. At the far end of the crevice is a juniper bush that Rumsey could have fallen into. We both believed in the juniper bush, and we both now wondered how it could suddenly be uncomfortably cool, as it had been on the evening of that record-hot day of August 5th, 1949. We were leaving a strange world. At the divide between Mann Gulch and Willow Creek, I turned my reluctant horse around and took a look at Mann Gulch. It's not possible from there to see all the way to the river because of the bend near its mouth, where the fire blew, jumped the gulch, and started up the canyon to meet the crew coming down. So the entity you see looking down Mann Gulch is not quite all of Mann Gulch, but the frame left of the Mann Gulch fire. It is a small, fierce, self-contained world made up of many worlds set off from the outside by fierce slopes and rocks. On either side is a different world, mountains to the south and west, and plains to the north and east. different ways to live and die. The 2-mile world of the Mann Gulch fire had already changed to many worlds for me, with many different feelings. The romantic earth of young men descending from the sky to find fire, the brutal earth performing a tragedy in a sense, an earth increasing in fierceness, refusing to yield up any more secrets of how to put things together, and always the sad world that parents cannot bear to visit. All were worlds in which I might have lived. Looking down on the worlds of the Mann Gulch fire for probably the last time, I said to myself, now we know, now we know. I kept repeating this line until I recognized that in the wide world anywhere, how we know, now we know, now we know, now we know. It's one of the most beautiful poems for me. For this moment anyway, my world was changed to this one-line poem. Finding it a poem, I hoped I could next complete it as a tragedy more exactly, as a story of a tragedy more exactly still, as a tragedy of this whole cockeyed world that probably always makes its own kind of sense and beauty, but not always ours. There was no water until we reached Willow Creek. I was sorry for the horses, but I was no longer sorry for us. Such can be the effect of the beauty of a very short poem.